I am so delighted to see so many beautiful faces on a simply gorgeous California evening. And for those who are visiting from out of town, yes, it is like this all the time.
Don't say that.
Right, they may come now. And I'm so glad that you could join us for the inaugural conference of the new Institute of American Cultures, Superdiversity, California Style, New Approaches to Race, Civil Rights, Governance, and Cultural Production. We are very fortunate tonight to have the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost of the university to provide the welcome. And for a couple reasons, it's very fitting. The reorganization and the re-envisioning of the IAC, of course, occurred under Provost Waugh's careful watch. And in fact, it emerged, I think, from his vision to advance ethnic studies, but also to incorporate an embrace of American studies, which we have never done, interestingly enough, at UCLA. He's also a historian, and tonight's panel, of course, is focused on the historical antecedents of superdiversity. So join me in welcoming Provost Scott Waugh.
Thank you very much, Melinda. I have to correct one thing. It's very gracious of you to attribute this to me, but it's not my vision, it's the vision of the people who made this possible. And long work, not only this year, but in a long time before that, who've put ethnic studies at UCLA on the map and have also made it the vital force that it is. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to UCLA on behalf of the Chancellor and everybody else at UCLA. And I think this is an auspicious occasion for two reasons. First of all, it really does inaugurate in a grand public style the Institute of American Cultures. And I think it has already proven to be in its short existence so far. There's a re-existence, a very vital force on the campus, bringing together a lot of different people, faculty, students, staff, in a common enterprise. And as Belinda articulated, it's partly an enterprise which is rooted in ethnic studies, partly an enterprise that's rooted in American studies, and it was really their ideal of coming together to talk about what they called an emerging America that I think really gives that force. And that idea is what underlies this inaugural conference, which is a tremendous opportunity to talk about superdiversity, California style, and what it means in the past, where it's going in the future, and how it affects all our lives. That kind of change in America, I think, is vital for study. All you have to do is pick up the paper each day, read a couple lines, and you know that this is the overriding concern of what's happening in the United States today. And on the one hand, for old people like me, it might be disconcerting and disorienting. But on the other hand, as the conference makes clear, it is also producing incredibly positive and important changes in the way in which we think about images, written text, food even. And so for those reasons, it's deserving of study. It's deserving of a conference like this, bringing together so many different people. So I hope you have a really grand time. Welcome to UCLA. It's not always like this outside. And enjoy yourselves. And thank you very much for attending. Take care.
I too, of course, want to welcome all the students, the faculty, the staff, the people who've come from across town and across the country. Welcome to California, welcome to UCLA, and welcome to the Institute for American Cultures. We've been working on planning this meeting for well over a year. It seems like it's been longer than that, but it has been over a year, so I really want to acknowledge all the hard-working people who make this possible. And I'm going to ask them to stand up, please. First is Devin Carballo, who's Professor of Law and also Associate Provost in the Chancellor's Office. Darnell Hunt, and where's Darnell? Darnell is Professor of Sociology and also the Director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. Chon Noriega, and Chon is Professor of Television and Digital Media, and he is the Director of the Chicano Studies Research Center. Angela Riley is Professor of Law, and she is the director of the American Indian Studies Center. And David Yu, historian. David is professor of Asian American Studies, a historian, and he's also the director of the Asian American Studies Center. We could not have done this without our amazing conference coordinator, Zella Johnson. She was hired, what was it, even 3 months ago? Awfully recent, and this was her first big job. I was a little embarrassed to throw all this on her at the last moment, but oh my goodness, how amazingly she's come through and made all the travel arrangements, done all the publicity. I've just been so amazed and grateful for her support. And then we have the staff of all of the ethnic studies centers. You'll see all these ambassadors in the back and all around, and if you need anything, they're here to help out. So I want to thank all of the staff members of the ethnic studies centers who have certainly made it much, much easier to put this on. And finally, I want to thank this artist, Sally Trace, who has done this wonderful piece of art and allowed us to use the images for the conference. She calls this urbanity too. It's her way of merging urban and humanity. And I have to tell you a brief story. I actually used another piece of her art 8 years ago for a conference. It was a launch for a series of conferences that started in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Unknowingly, I picked another piece of art by the same artist. So, I think it's an auspicious sign. It's saying something good about what we're doing. I'm going to talk very, very, very briefly about the origins of the Institute of American Culture. For those of you who have been here for many years, those of you who are as old as I am, the IAC has been around forever, and I'm sure you're wondering what on earth is new about the IAC. And in fact, I got a little note from our former chancellor, Charles Young, who said the same thing. What the heck is new about the IAC? It's been here. I helped put it together. A little history. Ford Foundation provided a grant to the university that birthed the IAC. The goal of that grant was to strengthen the commitment to ethnic studies, to expand ethnic studies, but to also give diversity a central place on the UCLA campus. So the IAC existed as a mechanism for the four centers to come together and award funding. We awarded research grants to faculty and students, over $3 million worth of research grants over 40 years. We also awarded fellowships to graduate students and to postdoctoral scholars, over $4 million to 300 different scholars. So it was a presence on this campus, and it really did forge ethnic studies identity at UCLA. Recently, within the last 2 years though, the IAC has evolved. Now it's a freestanding separate institute, and it houses the four centers. And our focus has changed a bit. Even though the four centers are still going to do the work that's important for each of the four ethnic centers, for the four large ethnic groups, we also figured out, of course, as everybody else has, that the world has changed. The world has changed substantially since the place that we lived in 40 years ago here in LA. I got a clue about how the world had changed. I think in 1980, I looked at the census reports, looked at the people who checked the box black on the 1980 census, and discovered that they came from over 100 different countries. And that's true for about every ethnic group in this area. The fact is that never before have so many people of such a variety of backgrounds come together and lived and worked in the same geographic space. Never before in human history have we experienced that. It's not just true in Los Angeles, it's also true in New York, in Miami, in London, in Amsterdam, which brings us to the term superdiversity. Where did this come from? In fact, that's the term that some of the British scholars were using to describe, what was an explosion of diversity for them. There was a fairly homogeneous culture that suddenly experienced an influx of immigrants from all over the world, people who didn't look like the people who had been living in Britain, people who spoke a different language, people who had different religions, and it turned to scholars to try to figure out what was going on. And you could certainly read, I think, a bit of terror probably in their writings. It's different here in Los Angeles, of course. Many of the people we've described as minority were here before anybody else. The original founders of Los Angeles, of course, were a multi-ethnic group. And that's part of what's going to be addressed tonight, the historical antecedents of diversity here in California. Now, of course, we're going to go into the details tomorrow, but California, of course, has been minority since before the 90s, so-called majority minority. By 2060, according to census figures, there will be no group that has a plurality in the United States. There will be no majority group. It looks like we're going to need different kinds of models of analysis, and that's one of the things we're going to be addressing over the next 4 days. So this new landscape is the focus of our meeting. We want to identify, obviously, the contours of superdiversity, but we're also trying to figure out what this means for civil rights, what it means for the pursuit of equality, what it means for redress, what it means for racialization, and what it means for cultural production. You're probably not going to find many of us using the term post-racial because we think that all the isms still exist: racism, classism, sexism. But the challenge, I think, is for us to figure out how to fit these continuing isms and new complexities into, I think, a viable model of change. So we'll get started now, and I want to first introduce the moderator of tonight's panel, Steve Aaron. He is professor and vice chair in the history department here at UCLA. He's also held an adjoint appointment at the Autry National Center. And for those of you who are not necessarily from the area, Autry is the Gene Autry that some of us remember for our childhood, some of us remember from TV Land, I guess. He has really brought a whole new vision to that place, and he served as executive director there, and is now chair of the Institute for the Study of the American West. He's authored numerous books, including How the West Was Lost, The Transformation of Kentucky from Daniel Boone to Henry Clay, An American Confluence, The Missouri Frontier from Borderlands to Border State. And he co-authored, I think, what must be the most intimidating title I have ever read, Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, A History of the World from the Beginnings of Humankind to the Present.
All in this title.
Oh, right, I just can't, I didn't know about it, I can't wait to look at it. He also edits Convergence magazine, and at the Autry, in his classes, he has made the convergence of peoples and cultures central to the way we approach history, the history of frontiers, of borderlands in the American West. And this coming Sunday at 6 o'clock at the Autry, he is going to be giving the inaugural John Gray lecture.
Thank you.
So we'll want to come see him at that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here and to get to be the kickoff speaker in what promises to be a really stimulating and exciting couple of days, exploring a theme and topics that are certainly near and dear to the work of my fellow panelists, as I'll explain in a moment. I think it's great that the Institute of American Culture, as it's been reconfigured or recreated, reimagined, brings together scholars from across disciplines and across the lines of ethnic studies to explore together not just the multicultural history of the United States and the Americas, but to ponder and probe the intercultural dimensions of that history. I confess, though, that while this is certainly a multidisciplinary enterprise, I'm pleased that it is a group of historians who get to go first. That's appropriate at this inaugural conference. It's appropriate because too often I think what we're calling superdiversity we tend to view as something entirely new. Now, to be sure, and Belinda sort of alluded to this in her opening remarks, to be sure, the term is relatively new. It's not a phrase that shows up in the deeper American historical record. And it's certainly not a concept that would have been embraced by too many in the not that distant past. I think that makes it all the more important that we grapple with how we got here, with how California came to be, at least, or came to be seen as a, if not the, capital of superdiversity. What I hope emerges then from this kickoff session is an appreciation for a history of California that recognizes how it has been in so many ways ahead of the curve in terms of diversity for many centuries. Now, of course, with this important point, even as that dynamic, or even as the dynamic interactions that this diversity introduced have often been vigorously resisted and repressed across those centuries. Now, it's in their work that my fellow panelists have done so much to uncover the work of California's long-standing cosmopolitanism and cultural convergences, as well as the efforts to constrict and restrict the ability of peoples to get together and to get along. California's superdiversity, I would emphasize, goes back a long way. Indeed, pre-colonial California already boosted greater diversity, as measured by linguistic and cultural variation, than almost any other part of the Americas. Recent work also on the Spanish and especially the Mexican era of California history has challenged the later Anglo caricature of the pre-American past as one in which inhabitants lived in a provincial backwater, is isolated in their quaint yet colorful and static corner. Instead, this scholarship has illuminated the extent to which Californians, or Californios, were increasingly entangled in global commerce, particularly in networks that connected California to a widening Pacific world. Of course, the thickness of these currents paled with the rush that followed the discovery of gold. That brought peoples from north, south, east, and west to California. Almost overnight, it made the state, and especially the city of San Francisco, the most cosmopolitan face, or the most cosmopolitan place on the face of the earth. Through the late 19th century, arguably, the city and its environs retained that status. In the last years of the 20th century and the first decades now of the 21st, Los Angeles, I think, has emerged as the new capital of superdiversity. That's a relatively recent transformation, and a surprising one, especially for those familiar with Eric Avila's path-breaking scholarship on race, popular culture, and the segregation of spaces in Southern California. Readers of Avila's Popular Culture in the Age of White Flight, Fear and Fantasy in Suburban Los Angeles would immediately wonder how a place whose boosters fashioned it as the nation's white spot has been so dramatically transformed, or maybe not. Still, as those of you have read Alison Varzali's prize-winning Making a Non-White America, Californians Coloring Outside Ethnic Lines know well, already in the second quarter of the 20th century, already in the second quarter of the 20th century, many places in California, most perhaps notably the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles, captured attention for its unrivaled population mix and convergence of cultures there. Now, at the time, at least in the eyes of authorities, this notoriety made Boyle Heights notorious. As a 1939 report by the Federal Housing Agency, one that I think is quoted both in Eric Avila's work and Alison Varzali's work, and maybe quoted in Brenda Stevenson's new book as well, I'm not sure. As that 1939 report by the Federal Housing Agency made clear, Boyle Heights was condemned as a place that was, quote, hopelessly heterogeneous for its diverse and subversive racial elements. Now, Boyle Heights figures prominently, I should say, and we have our curator here, Karen Wilson, so I'll do another shameless plug for an upcoming Autry exhibition. Boyle Heights figures prominently in the soon-to-open, May 8th, Karen?
May 10th.
May 10th, soon-to-open exhibition, Jews in the Los Angeles Mosaic. Now, as that exhibition relates, and it follows closely actually on Alison Varzali's work, in the early decades of the 20th century, the district attracted a wide assortment of newcomers. By the 1930s, the diverse racial elements that made the district a bad risk for housing loans in the eyes of federal agents then included people of Mexican and Japanese descent, African Americans, and perhaps most numerous of all, Jews. Most of them came to Boyle Heights because its housing was more affordable than many other parts of Los Angeles, and because those houses did not always carry the restrictive covenants that kept those deemed as non-white, a category that still by and large included Jews, from other Los Angeles neighborhoods. Now, to government authorities, as I said a moment ago, this heterogeneity appeared hopeless. But within the community, diverse neighbors found the mosaic more promising. Not hopeless, the Boyle Heights mosaic that emerges in Varzali's book and in the Autry's upcoming exhibition offers a much more hopeful historical example of superdiversity. I do think, though, exhibition goers, readers of Alison's book, should approach the Boyle Heights section with a critical eye, lest they succumb to a growing tendency to romanticize intergroup relations in the California and Western past. A search for kinder, gentler frontier stories that I've sometimes derided as kumbaya colonialism. I suspect that memories of bygone Boyle Heights may be subject to similar distortions, the nostalgic tint of rose-colored glasses accentuating concord at the expense of conflict, tidying up the messiness of mixings in California. Now, that weariness became more deeply ingrained when I read Brenda Stevenson's soon-to-be published and transformative book, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots. Here, Stevenson tells the entwined stories of Latasha Harlins, Soon Jadu, Joyce Carlin, and finds in this intersection no kumbaya singing around the campfire. Instead, her recounting of the protagonists' biographies and the deeper histories that brought their lives together offers a much more cautionary tale about the challenges of getting along in the most super diverse of cities. So, with that as my introductory remarks, let me spend just 2 or 3 more minutes introducing the panelists, starting with Alison Varzali, who, I should say, made heroic efforts to get here. That if you heard one side, the sunshine side of Los Angeles, when you stepped outside today, Alison can tell you another side of Los Angeles, having made it up here from Cal State Fullerton this afternoon on a 2.5-hour excursion on the Los Angeles freeways, probably the last hour of it spent within 1.5 miles of the Westwood campus, trying to make her way here. Heroically, though, she has arrived from her point of origin as an associate professor in the Department of History at Cal State Fullerton. Her research interests, as I mentioned, include the history of immigration and multicultural relations in the 20th century United States. I mentioned her first book, Making Non-White America, Californians Coloring Across Ethnic Lines, Outside Ethnic Lines, 1925 to 1955, which examines the everyday interactions among Asian, Mexican, African, Native, and Jewish Americans, and others who lived side by side during the second quarter of the 20th century in California. What she finds is that in shared spaces across California, these diverse groups mixed and mingled as students, lovers, worshipers, workers, and family members, and along the way expanded and reconfigured ethnic and racial categories in new directions. Alison Varzali earned her PhD in history, proudly I can say, from UCLA in 2002. Next to her is my colleague Eric Avila, who is associate professor at UCLA in the Cesar E. Chavez Department of Chicano Studies, at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs Urban Planning. And he also should be mentioned here, though it's not in the biography, that he's associate professor of history, and that's really the one he wants to come first. Incredibly, though, he didn't put it that way. Professor Avila's field of studies are 20th century United States history, urban and cultural history, popular and mass culture, the history of architecture and the built environment, race and ethnicity, and Chicano studies. His research has won numerous awards and prizes, including various pieces for articles, as well as for the book that I mentioned, The Must-Read, Popular Culture in the Age of White Flight, film and fantasy in Los Angeles, as I mentioned. He also was a recent postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center, where he began work on a second project that is coming along on the folklore of the freeway. University of Minnesota, is that where we're going? University of Minnesota Press, very soon. He earned his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of California at Berkeley before he came to the UCLA, where he has been since
1997.
Ooh, we're dating. Now we're feeling older. 1997. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Brenda Stevenson, who's a professor of history at UCLA. She's the past chair of the Department of History, as well as past chair of the Interdepartmental Program in Afro-American Studies. Brenda Stevenson is the author of the award-winning book, Black and White, Life in Black and White. She's the editor of the Journals of Charlotte Fort and Grimke, the co-editor of the multi-volume Encyclopedia of Black Women's History, co-author of The Underground Railroad, as well as author of numerous scholarly articles, and recipient of numerous fellowships as well. Her new book, as I say, which will be published within a month, next month, April.
It should be in May, yeah.
Oh, very soon. Is, as I mentioned, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots, which will be available from Oxford University Press very soon, and will be on all of your reading lists shortly after. So with that, let me turn it over. Each of the panelists is then going to speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for conversation, first among ourselves, and then with all of you. Listen.
Well, Steve, thank you for that kind introduction. And while trapped in traffic, I was thinking that California is not only super diverse, but super congested. It's a real delight to be here. Thank you to the conference organizers for the opportunity to be here and to join a conversation about the super diversity of California, past and present. And I think too often when we confront the challenges of managing, accommodating, and interpreting our current ethno-racial diversity, we don't pay sufficient attention to history. And I wanted to, during my brief remarks, reveal some of the discoveries from my own research, which has focused upon the multi-ethnic, multiracial relations among California minorities who shared common neighborhoods in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and joined together in political collaborations and coalitions that successfully toppled legal discriminations in housing, education, and marriage just after World War II. And in the 1920s and 1930s, the rush of so many migrants and immigrants to California made a diverse state even more so. And the state had been diverse, but the arrival of these newcomers who are driven by new political constraints and economic limitations in their home regions, that are in turn shaped often by engagements of the United States in those home regions, really exaggerates and accelerates California's diversity. And these new arrivals, as they join established minorities, prefer to live independently overall. Their ethno-racial thinking is such that they enjoy the company of one another who might share the same religious values, the same languages, the same foods, the same general traditions, and yet because of informal and formal restrictions in Californians, they are driven together. And in other regions of the United States in the period, in the mid-20th century, living on the other side of the tracks usually meant living in mono-ethnic ghettos. So there was a section for kind of Italians and Italian Americans, a section for Chinese and Chinese Americans, a section for kind of Polish Americans. But in California, things were different. When you were living on the other side of the tracks, when you were segregated from majority whites, you were often living in environments in which you were integrated with other minorities. And certainly Boyle Heights is a prime example, but other examples in California, I'll name just a few, included West Oakland, the Fillmore and Western Addiction sections in San Francisco, Central Stockton, East Sacramento, the Plaza area in South Watsonville. And a mix of policies, laws, and practices generated these majority-minority districts. Most notably, the restrictive housing covenants that required white homeowners and property owners to rent and sell only to other whites, prohibited those sales and rentals to minorities. And in that time, minorities were delineated as there's Asian ethnics, Mexicans, Jewish immigrants, and certainly African Americans. But also slum clearance projects and various zoning laws made for the clustering of different minorities in these spaces. Moreover, limited economic resources meant that oftentimes these minorities simply couldn't afford to purchase housing in pricier white neighborhoods. De facto segregation in public areas, schools, places of worship, businesses made the intermingling of non-whites likely as well. Mexicans, Asians, and blacks frequently watched movies in sections of the theater that were separated from whites. They swam together in public pools the day before they were drained to accommodate white swimmers, and they sat in sections of restaurants that were separated from whites. Commercial districts that were tucked inside these multi-ethnic minority neighborhoods also brought minorities together in contact. The reluctance of whites often to employ other minorities and to fairly compensate minorities meant that if you were shopping, if you were looking for an after-school job, if you were looking for medical attention, if you were looking for a drink at the end of the day, you were commonly getting those services from other minorities in those common spaces. The consequence of this proximity was the creation of complex, often competing attachments among these minority neighbors. For youths in the neighborhoods, for whom contacts with one another often mattered as much to their own socialization as anything their family said or did, or their larger community said or did, or more formal institutions, these youth often kind of bent and adjusted the ethno-racial boundaries that divided them. Now, most of these young people that I studied remained somewhat sensitive to the cultural traditions of their parents and grandparents. And so when they borrowed or kind of sampled the cultures of their peers, it was in a careful way. They might copy a hairstyle. They might learn a few words in another language. They might listen to one another's music. But even if these connections and exchanges seemed somewhat superficial, they did introduce and reinforce a more multicultural ethos, one that was often confirmed and reinforced by educators in the period who were practicing a model of education that they called internationalism, which in some ways was an early precursor of ethnic studies, the idea of using kind of international relations to try to encourage and model good interactions among their diverse students. And students at places like Los Angeles's Roosevelt High or Lincoln High, and I use those high schools just as examples of other high schools and educational spaces throughout California, celebrated this diversity in the pages of their yearbooks, in their newspapers, and in their choice of extracurricular organizations like the World Friendship Club and the Cosmopolitan Club. Within these multi-ethnic neighborhoods, there was also a small but highly visible population of minority youths who even more aggressively crossed over ethnic lines and scoffed at the conventions of Americanization that were proposed by kind of middle-class Anglos. This subset of adolescents designed a street-centered, oppositional, truly multi-ethnic version of a youth culture. And Mexican Americans were the most visible, conspicuous, talked about participants, the so-called pachucos, but a wide variety of minority adolescents participated. And as marginalized members of these urban, working class, often kind of immigrant neighborhoods, they had reason to resent the conditions of their lives and kind of dress and act accordingly. And signature attributes of this mixed oppositional youth culture included a style of dress that was distinct from their mainstream peers, a style of speech that blended both English and foreign languages, and preferences for music that combined African American jazz and Mexican rancheros. Now, this crisscrossing of ethnic lines among these minority youth in these multi-ethnic neighborhoods sometimes became more permanent and mature commitments. Minority neighbors in mid-century California also dated and married one another. Such relations were not the norm, and they were rarely recommended by family members or community members, but they did happen. And they happened between folks like Eddie and Gloria Arosa. She was the daughter of Filipino immigrants, and he was the son of a Mexican-American woman and a Filipino contract worker in the San Joaquin Valley. And Gloria explained that she had sought out a husband who was at least in part of Mexican descent because she'd grown up with Mexican Americans, and that she found that they combined a unique combination of toughness and kindness that she revered. These kinds of intercultural intimacies also happen between couples like Alice Chioco and Felisberto Tapia. This Japanese-American woman and this Filipino-American boy, their marriage actually precipitated a round of conflicts within their community of Filipinos and Japanese that ultimately forced the couple's separation. But they had found something that was common to one another despite their cultural differences or perceived cultural differences. The relations also happened between C.S. Machida, who was a Chinese-American woman in San Francisco, and a Japanese man, and she credited her Japanese husband for rescuing her from a Chinese-American community that she described as conservative and kind of hostile to women's interests. And as a final example, it happened between Blanche and Bert Corona. She was the daughter of Jewish immigrants. He was the son of Mexican migrants. They met in Los Angeles, and they shared left-leaning political views and joined together in various civil rights coalitions in the 40s and the 50s. These relationships expressed a willingness to defy the convention that one should marry and date within one's own ethno-racial group. Such a convention, these couples believe, reflected awkward and very antiquated notions of what constituted community in the 30s and 40s, notions that really ran counter to their own experiences of working and living in these multi-ethnic, multiracial environments. These rebel couples confronted greater difficulties, often in more homogeneous pairs, but it didn't make their families any more kind of fragile or vulnerable. And they drew together because they located common values and habits that transcended traditional cultural divisions. And they were still, though, very attentive to questions of color, of history, of differences in expectations about gender and generation. Now, violence against zoot suiters and the internment of Japanese Americans shook up these mixed-race couples and the communities to which they belonged. These dramatic acts of injustice at a time of pronounced democratic rhetoric startled minorities into reconsidering their own positions and their own kind of place in California society. For Japanese Americans, kind of internment eroded a somewhat fragile sense of security and a distinction from other minorities. As one Nisei noted, and I quote, "I used to wish I were a white person because it's a handicap to have a Jap face. But now that I'm in the camps, this racial discrimination is not too bad when I know that there are other racial groups in the same fix, like the Negroes, Jews, Chinese, and Filipinos." For mixed families with Japanese members, and by that I mean Japanese individuals who were married to non-Japanese, the reality of internment forced them to make the very painful choice of either entering the camps together, defying the government orders and remaining together outside the camps, or choosing to separate and hope that they could weather the separation till the internment hopefully ended. Now, other minority Californians didn't experience, of course, internment with the same immediacy or intensity of Japanese, but they still reconsidered and spoke out against the American racial system because of that injustice. Jews, Mexicans, and various other Asian ethnics who had known Japanese Americans prior to the war professed their solidarity with Japanese Americans in more private statements in letters that they sent to internees, in gifts that they directed to those internees, and fears that they might be the next group that was singled out for this segregation and injustice quieted their protests. So they were not as kind of noisy or institutionalized in their challenges to internment, but I would argue that their private statements and expressions of solidarity still mattered and helped shape their evolving kind of political consciousness and would inform their civil rights efforts in the post-war period. Injustices that were suffered by zoot suiters also built solidarity among these minorities. Not only did the zoot suit as a style of dress and a set of behaviors actually become more popular during World War II, including among Japanese Americans within the camps who were kind of frustrated by their experience and kind of acted out through this dress. But after the riots in 1943, Mexican and African Americans are offering a broad criticism of Los Angeles officials and the LAPD, and African Americans in the pages of their newspapers are calling for connections and solidarities with Mexican Americans to partner with them to try to kind of change the way that their neighborhoods are policed and the way that they are perceived. These wartime shocks, internment, and the Zoot Suit riots, as well as the experiences of shared living and working, as well as a heightened commitment broadly to interracial organization in the post-war period, led Asian and Mexican, African, and Jewish Americans of mixed neighborhoods to selectively collaborate in the post-war period. Through individual gestures of support, through multi-ethnic collaboration and localized campaigns, these frequent neighbors sought to free themselves from some of the worst restrictions in marriage and housing and education and citizenship. Now, their strategies for realizing these interests were rarely perfectly aligned. Concerns about, again, color and culture and history mattered. So Asian ethnics in these political coalitions often were much more concerned about immigration reforms and trying to change the perception that they were perpetually foreign, while Mexican and African Americans often talked about the necessity of school segregation and new kind of housing opportunities. But even if there are differences in the particularities of the civil rights agendas of these groups, increasingly they are embracing the credo that discrimination against one ultimately hurts them all. So when minorities are gathering together, they are doing so to kind of challenge, again, these restrictions in housing, in education, in marriage. And they are successful. Through their multi-ethnic, minority-focused coalitions, they instigated and won court-based challenges to school segregation, anti-miscegenation statutes, and restrictive housing covenants, thus creating more legal freedoms for minorities. So at least in theory, by the late 1940s and early 1950s, minorities were able to live where they wanted, learn where they wanted, and marry whom they pleased. But despite these legal triumphs, minorities walked with significant hesitation and trepidation into the 1950s and beyond. And I know that Eric and Brenda are going to talk about this period in much greater depth. But the discriminations that had been sustained in law, that had been eliminated, survive in practice. Incentives for collaboration remained, but the more private nature of prejudice made it harder for these minorities to figure out how to collaborate and move forward. Anti-communist campaigns also forced them to moderate, if not eliminate, their civil rights activities. And maybe most importantly, suburbanization and these downtown restructuring projects eliminated the kind of majority-minority neighborhoods that had generated the social, cultural, and political ties that I described. That said, if the particular constellation of ethno-racial groups that had come together in the 40s and early 50s did not last, their example of coalition did. And Californians who would join efforts to try to fight for fair housing and fair employment practices in the later 20th century drew upon this legacy of multi-ethnic cooperation. And I think as we consider the prospects for coexisting in a state that has become even more diverse, even more a global place because of accelerated immigration, I think we might reference that past. Thanks, I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you you, Steve, for that very nice introduction, and thank you for outing me as a historian, all of these people. As one of the most diverse concentrations of humanity in the world, Los Angeles is not what it was supposed to be. This American city, born of a racialized conquest that relegated its original inhabitants as inferior, was envisioned over a century ago by very wealthy and very powerful men as a national outpost of white supremacy. To a certain extent, they succeeded in implementing that vision. In the span of about 150 years, Los Angeles earned its reputation as an American city by marginalizing and subordinating people of color. This included a strict enforcement of white supremacy through both legal and extra-legal means. It began, of course, with the decimation of indigenous peoples, but it subsequently included the conquest of a peaceful and sovereign nation, the lynching of its former citizens, the massacre of Chinese immigrants, the segregation of African Americans and Mexican Americans, the internment of Japanese Americans, and practices of racial exclusion at the workplace, in public facilities, and especially in the private spaces of the neighborhood. And how these practices continue in the present is something that I hope comes up throughout the symposium. These are all examples of what the ethnic studies scholars Michael Omi and Harold Wynant would call racial projects, which helped to organize resources along racial lines, ensuring that LA would fulfill its destiny as the nation's white spot. And this term white spot is an old trope in the history of Los Angeles. From the second president of USC, that other school on the other side of town, Joseph P. Whitney, who wrote Race Life of the Aryan Peoples in 1903 to argue that Los Angeles would mark the very pinnacle of Anglo-American progress and civilization, all the way to Police Chief William Parker, who directed his force in the 1950s to maintain the city's de facto patterns of racial segregation. The notion of Los Angeles as the nation's white spot suited powerful mythologies that assured Los Angeles of its white American identity. Late 19th century Los Angeles, fresh off a racialized conquest, didn't know what to do with its Spanish and Mexican past, so it whitewashed it, exploiting its remnants in the built environment to construct a powerful mythology that could help to sell Los Angeles to prospective tourists, residents, and businessmen. By the 1930s, the most iconic examples of this mythology included Olvera Street, US Route 101, better known as El Camino Real, and every single red tiled roof in Southern California. This mythology, known among LA historians as the Spanish fantasy past, fueled the burgeoning economic sectors of housing, tourism, and entertainment at the turn of the century. It erased the regional history of violence, conquest, and subordination. It sanitized and repackaged that past to accommodate racialized patterns of urban development. And it relegated Mexicans to the city's past, grounding LA's imagined future in the racial destiny of Anglo-Saxon civilization. For about half a century, the Spanish fantasy past defined the public identity of Los Angeles. As the city rapidly emerged as a new paradigm of capitalist urbanization, it embraced a paradoxical image of itself as an idyllic paradise of sunshine, palm trees, crumbling missions, lazy Mexican men, and voluptuous Mexican women happy to serve an expanding white middle class. In a palm-studded landscape of white stucco, red brick, and red tile, the conspicuous distinctions between Irish, Jewish, English, Catholic, Slavic, Protestant, and Italian magically faded into a vague and empty whiteness. Through this mythology, Los Angeles emerged as a factory for the production of whiteness, spun through an array of cultural technologies, from advertisements to postcards to motion pictures. Make no mistake, this was the cultural legacy of conquest, the colonization of history itself, reworked, reimagined to suit the ideological imperatives of white supremacy. The myth of the Spanish fantasy past could not survive the intensive phase of modernization that ensued in Southern California during the mid-20th century, after World War II. So the city needed a new identity, a new set of images and experiences that could rejuvenate an aging myth of whiteness. So it gave us theme parks like Disneyland, with ordered, regimented spaces that enforced nationalist idealizations of the small town, the frontier, and of technological progress. It gave us Dodger Stadium, which inserted the game as American as apple pie into the heart of the old city on the rubble of what had been a cohesive Mexican-American community. And it gave us freeways, which enabled Southern Californians to skip from one island of whiteness to another, gliding across expanding pools of racial poverty. This new cultural infrastructure redefined the myth of Los Angeles for the post-war period. It was not foisted upon an unwitting and unknowing public. It was purchased by a new white suburban middle class, eager to secure its whiteness and its property, fearful of the inner city, taking refuge in self-contained suburban enclaves that sheltered a homogeneous landscape of tract homes, shopping malls, and supermarkets. This generation of white suburban Americans created this myth through their spending power. It provided comfort, convenience, and reassurance in a time of tremendous social and economic upheaval. It's a myth that these myths have no relevance to the lived experience of daily life. These myths are built into every structure, every block, every neighborhood, every municipality from Beverly Hills to Boyle Heights, built by ordinary men and women who shared these myths to make sense of a weird, new, alienating environment like that of Southern California. In other words, this wasn't false consciousness, it was a form of common sense. These were the dominant mythologies. They dominated the image of the city. They defined the public face, not the historical reality of Los Angeles for much of its history. But they created and shaped a whole way of recognizing and knowing this city. And they carry weight. And it's the weight of that history that we confront here today. Los Angeles always has been and always will be diverse. That's a mandate of its geography. But what do we make of that diversity? That, I think, is the important question. Do we fight against it or strive to eradicate it, as was the case throughout most of the history of Los Angeles, at least until the 1960s? Or do we deny it or ignore it, as was the case after the 1960s? Or do we recognize it, celebrate it, embrace it, as we're doing here today, and as we have been doing more and more? It's fine to celebrate diversity, but only if you're committed to acknowledging and eradicating the inequality that accompanies diversity, especially in the historical context of our city. Here in LA, historically, super diversity means super inequality. And I hope we don't lose sight of this fact in the remainder of the discussion today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Steve, for your introduction. Thank you to my co-panelists for wonderful talks that have made me feel like, oh my God, why am I last? You know, Allison was late, so Steve told me that I was going to be first, maybe, and I thought, okay, good. No one listens to the first speaker very closely. You know, but now I realize that, in fact, we're listening very closely to every speaker, so I should thank you all for that, though. 20 years ago, I was struck by this city's diversity. I had just moved to Los Angeles, to what clearly was an extraordinarily different city from Austin, Texas, where I had been teaching at the University of Texas. What I immediately realized was that I could not tell who anyone was. I remember going on a hike with Val Smith, for those people who remember, our distinguished colleague from the English department, who's now very distinguished at Princeton. And I went on a hike with Val, and when I got back home, I talked to my husband, who was still in Virginia, and he said to me, well, who did you go with? And I said, I mentioned the people. He says, where? Were they all black like you and Val, or were they, whiter? And I said, I don't know what they were, to tell you the truth. And he said, what? I said, I don't know. And it struck me, I didn't know. I'm from the South, born and raised through my middle childhood in the segregated South, where everyone had a racial identity, an identifiable racial identity. Although all people did not look alike, you learned to discern the traces of color, phenotype, and hair texture, the slight differences in the ways in which people spoke, accent, grammar, rhythm, or what they spoke about, that marked your side of the racial divide, white or black. There was nothing in between. You were either white or black, as the census takers determined if your parents had not. Even attending college, which again was in the South, or graduate school, which was in the Northeast, Yale, did not shape this fundamental truth for me. Although certainly I met and befriended persons of different races and ethnicities while studying at Yale, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, South Asians, Filipinos, Africans, different ethnicities, Europeans from different nations, etc. My life, it didn't really change my fundamental socialization around the dichotomy of race. My life in Texas shifted and expanded my gaze to persons from Central America with whom I interacted while I was at Rice in Houston, and later as a young faculty member in Austin. Still, I was not prepared for the assault of differences and diversity, racial, ethnic, and cultural, that I met when I arrived at UCLA and in Los Angeles in the winter of 1991. Understand how wedded I was to the black-white dichotomy. My first book is titled Life in Black and White. As such, I was very curious about this new reality, this super diversity. This place, this new world, inspired a different sort of intellectual process for me. I was drawn to understanding what it meant to live in such an environment, particularly what hierarchies existed, how they formed, and how once formed they impacted such diverse constituents. So as I became aware that diversity folded up in Latasha Harlan's case, which is what I'm going to speak about, I wanted to exercise and exorcise some of my intellectual and personal curiosity of this new racial/ethnic/ reality or order by examining it within this case. An added benefit to me as an historian of women, at least partially so, was that the super diversity folded up and throughout this case was one of women. And for those of you who do not remember this case, I'm going to tell you very briefly about it. On the unseasonably cool, damp Saturday of March 16, 1991, at approximately 9:35 a.m., 15-year-old Latasha Hollins walked into the Empire Liquor Market located at 9172 South Figueroa Street in Compton, California. Within the course of 5 short minutes, she lay dying in front of the store's counter, bleeding from a single close-range gunshot wound to the back of her head. The 2 neighborhood children ran away from the store in horror. The shop owner's wife, Sunja Du, sat crouched on top of the counter trying to see where Hollins had fallen. The middle-aged woman's face already was beginning to swell and discolor from the brief but violent struggle between the two that began when the storekeeper accused her young customer of trying to steal a $1.79 bottle of orange juice. 2 useless dollars meant to pay for the juice sat crumpled in the stillbirth girl's left hand. Now, Latasha Hollins was shot and killed 2 weeks after the LAPD pulled Rodney King from his car and whipped him, beat him. The videotape of King's senseless beating riveted the world, casting Los Angeles again in its stark but typical black and white racial male construct. As painful as it was to watch, the racial dynamic behind the King beating, no matter how disturbing, has been a fixture in American history that these types of events, such a fixture, these types of events were almost predictable. Trayvon Martin, for example. The black community was still digesting the latest version of the white lynch mob turned against black masculinity when, through the beating of Rodney King, when another videotape, that of Soon Ja Du shooting LaTosha Hollins in the back of the head, hit the airwaves. The shooting was devastating, but it also was profoundly different from the usual violent scenarios across racial lines that typically garner public outrage. The people involved, Soon Ja Du and LaTosha Hollins, were female, not male. Du was Korean, not white. She was a mother, wife, and shopkeeper, not a policeman, deputy sheriff, security guard, or domestic terrorist with a white sheet over his head. LaTosha was killed mid-morning with witnesses present, not in some isolated field or highway in the dark of night. Her murder was not another challenge of black masculinity, that constant theme in the history of race in America. It underscored instead the vulnerability of the most defenseless in the nation's socially constructed hierarchy. Women and children are the racially, culturally, economically, and politically marginalized. Now, an analysis of the people v. Du has great significance, in part because it sheds a unique light on the complicated cases of women historically and currently in America's diverse society and in LA's superdiversity. It serves remarkably well as a case study that exposes the complexity of the female in the United States as part of a distinct group, but also in relationship to one another. The gendered, racialized, classist, cultural, and generational aspects of this case are quite unique enough to lend themselves to an examination of the sometimes overlapping, sometimes complementary, sometimes oppositional realities of late 20th century female life in urban America. All the case's lead actors, for example, the victim, the defendant, and the judge, were female. They were all from a different race or ethnicity within the superdiversity realm of Los Angeles. Du was Korean, Hollins was African American, and Colin is Jewish. Each represented a different generation, and all three were from different socioeconomic classes. Du, a shopkeeper, was 51 years old when arrested. LaTosha was a 15-year-old girl from the working class, and Colin was a wealthy 40-year-old judge whose father was a leading Hollywood insider. What effects, indeed, did race, ethnicity, class, gender, or a combination of some of these variables have on any or all aspects of this case of the people v. Du, and the questions of justice that emerge from it is what I have been seeking to find out. Would LaTosha Hollins have cursed at or struck a white or black shopkeeper, as she did Soon Ja Du? Would she have behaved this way if Mr. Du had been behind the counter that Saturday morning instead of his wife? Would Soon Ja Du have assumed that LaTosha was stealing if the teen was white or Asian or male or adult? Would she have pulled a gun on an Asian or white adolescent, whether male or female, or black male, or Latina or Latino? Will LaTosha have turned and walked away if the white, Latino, or black woman or man had a gun pointed at her? Would the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office have charged Soon Ja Du with first-degree murder with special circumstances, potential death penalty case, if she had not been an Asian woman and her victim not a black girl? If Soon Ja Du had been male, if the beating of Rodney King had not exposed the LAPD's racist legacy to the world just 2 weeks before? What about Judge Joyce Carlin, perhaps the most controversial of the three females? Would she have given Du a harsher punishment had the shopkeeper been of a different race? Or had she been male or younger? Or had a different occupation? If LaTosha had not been black? If Colin had not been Jewish? Were her actions as judge mere mimicry of what white male judges do when women of color, females of the super minority, come to their courtrooms? Or did her gender or ethnicity have some influence on her decisions? Would she have been assigned this controversial case had she not been young, female, inexperienced, or Jewish? Cultural difference, a concept at the various intersections of race, class, gender, generation, and even geography, is also important to think about. Embedded as culture is within the layered constructs of other socially significant variables and characteristics investigated here, it is sometimes especially difficult to assign what impact it had on the ways in which women interact with each other formally or informally. It is clear, for example, that the U.S. judiciary system has a cultural foundation rooted in Western ideals, philosophies, and conventions, including gender conventions. As such, one might imagine that a person's place and treatment in this system would depend, in part, on one's gendered and racial relationships to Western patriarchal cultures. Were the actions of these three females, singularly or in relationship to one another, affected by their cultural backgrounds? I maintain that much of the outcome of this case can be understood when one examines closely the personal biographies and group histories of Latasha Hollins, Sunja Du, and Joyce Collin. Their individuals' life stories and those of their ancestors are windows into their personal socialization and perspectives that must have affected the ways in which they regarded and responded to one another. These histories illuminate the legal, social, economic, and cultural trajectories, assumptions, and popular depictions and stereotypes that eventually led Hollins, Du, and Collin to encounter one another and laid the foundations for the terms of those encounters and their outcomes in the superdiversity landscape of the late 20th century Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I said in my opening remarks that I was pleased that we historians got to go first. And I said that's the way it should be. And Eric then said, no, he's not going to own fully that label. But I guess I think we get to go first because one of the things I hope we did was that, and just looking back actually at the description of the symposium, and it starts with over the past 2 decades, Los Angeles, da-da-da-da-da. And I hope one of the things that came out of this opening round here is just an appreciation that one has to look beyond the last 2 decades to understand the patterns that we confront in the present. And Eric made the point just in terms of the ways in which the myth matters, but I think it's the way in which a deeper history matters. At the same time, in thinking about the other questions that the conference summary asks us to take up, I wonder how useful we've been as historians. That for one thing, as is usually the case with historians, we've failed to offer singular and clear messages. I think the stories we've told, the lessons that might be offered that come out of the 3 presentations are certainly contradictory, moving back and forth between what I said was the hopeless and the hopeful in terms of superdiversity, the ways in which we approach superdiversity and the ways in which we think about intercultural connections. I'm not sure we're going to sort that out or offer the kind of forecasts for the future that this conference is sort of geared towards as well. I think we as historians are always better at predicting the past than we are at forecasting the future. That said, I guess I would like to sort of open up with just a question about and this is actually on the conference agenda, kind of what's next? Or in particular, in terms of the kind of historical research that we should be doing. Coming out of the projects that you've done and that you're doing, where would you point people to go in order to sort of better understand superdiversity and its connections to super inequality, or the relations between different peoples of color and the ways in which they've managed to come together and not come together? Where do we go from here? Brendan, would you like to go first? Because you got to go last the last time, and I don't want to, put you way down.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure exactly where we should go. Where we should go next. I have to be honest. I'm a historian of the American South, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So this project was very much inspired by as I said, moving to Los Angeles in 1991. I was here for about three months before the Rodney King incident happened, and then 2 weeks later, Latasha Hollins happened. So what the heck is going on here? So it took me a long road off of what I typically do, of which I will not, and I will be returning to what I typically do after this. So really, I will not stay as a Los Angeles historian, I can tell you that. But one of the things that It's too hard interviewing live people, I have to. I'd rather read what they left behind versus confront what they still carry with them. But I think if I was going to do other projects in Los Angeles, I would continue to look at those groups of people that people typically don't look at. I would look at young people. I would look at adolescents, for example. I would look at children. I would look at older elders within the communities. I would look at women. I like to look at marginalized people and people that we don't think about because, in fact, there are more marginalized people in our societies always than other people. And so I'd like to know more about what those groups that we don't typically think about, even when we think about marginalized people, where we would go with that. You know, I write on African Americans particularly, and I've written some on children and adolescents, but I haven't spent a lot of time doing that. And there are ways in which I think different questions we can ask of every group that we haven't asked, and I think that those questions should be asked. The difficulty, of course, of doing comparatives, histories within this superdiversity that we look at is that methodologically it's difficult because you have different sources for each group of people, and therefore you're trying to ask the same questions of every group so that you can have comparable comparative answers. And so I think that that's a methodological issue.
Actually, let me just press one point here, since you're going to abandon us as Los
Have
Angeles
abandoned
historians.
you.
No,
That's my last time.
sort of, as someone who came here, was sort of confused by the complexities of the landscape, but now we're going to go back to the South, in a sense. Having done your excursion into LA history, into superdiversity, how are you going to look at the South in a different way than you did?
Oh, it's really affected the way in which I look at the South. I mean, I work now, I'm writing a book on slave women, but it's the book that starts in Africa and it begins with the various ethnicities of those women who came over and what their lives were like prior to arriving, even as enslaved people in West Africa, and what that meant in terms of who they married and how they shaped the institution of slavery themselves, given what their lives were like ancestrally prior to that. So it's really affected the ways in which I look at my work for the American South as well.
I just want to respond to something you had said, Stephen, in your comments just now. I'm not sure that we've created more questions than answers on this panel. I think what we've done quite well, if I may say so myself, is we've laid out the context for this conference. We've laid out the big picture historical context of Los Angeles. And I think any exploration of diversity in Los Angeles today needs to understand the big picture of where LA has been in its past. And this is something that I think distinguishes LA from other American cities. It was born of a racialized conquest. And its geography, its location in the southwestern corner of the United States, as I said, it mandates a diversity that goes back to its very origins. I mean, if you know anything, I know very little about indigenous cultures of Southern California pre-contact, but I do know that it was a tremendously diverse setting, linguistically, culturally diverse, spiritually diverse, geographically diverse. If you look at the list of the original settlers who came from Mexico to Los Angeles under the program of Spanish colonization, there's about maybe 20 different caste categories that the Spaniards had invented to classify their population, from African to pure-blooded Spanish and everything in between. So yes, this diversity has been a part of Los Angeles, and I think that we need to understand that kind of big picture context, and that's what historians do. We kind of look at how things that happen in the present are not born in the present, they're born in the past. And I think each of us, in very different ways, I realize my talk was kind of the opposite of the other two talks, but it's part of the context that I think is necessary to grapple with the issue of racial and ethnic diversity in particular in Los Angeles.
But let me ask you a question similar to the one I just asked Brenda, because your first book was about Los Angeles in suburban Southern California. And now you're moving in the Folklore of the Freeway book more broadly to look at urban America. But I guess I'd sort of ask the same question. And it's actually part of a larger challenge that I think this conference raises, which is about how the histories and lessons of superdiversity that start in California don't stay in California. And that's in some ways also what lessons you take away from sort of California's history and folklore of the freeway and racialized conquest as you explore the other urban settings in which freeways bisected neighborhoods and disrupted lives and created alternative cultures of resistance to them.
Right. So this book that I'm finishing up is called The Folklore of the Freeway, Highway Construction and the Making of Race in the Modernist City. And it's about the impact of highway construction on inner city communities and how people within those communities expressed the experience of highway construction through cultural expression, through art and literature and poetry and murals, in using cultural resources in the absence of political and economic resources. And I learned that in Los Angeles. I mean, you know, Los Angeles with its ubiquitous freeways, its racial and ethnic communities that most often is the case lack, you know, hard access to political and economic opportunity. Culture is a resource to express the politics of dissent or opposition. I learned that here in LA, and it was only by studying freeways in LA for my first book that I began to realize that this pattern was happening in other settings as well. And I do believe, as a cultural historian, that LA is a site where you have to engage with culture because of communities' reliance upon culture. It's not ideal. You know, in an ideal world, every community would have access to structural resources, politics, and economy, but that's not the case. And culture plays a vital role, not just in the context of LA history, but you know, in the context of other inner cities in the United States after World War II.
Just then in terms of the other question I was about the sort of research agendas that you would sort of push people towards to sort of better understand the sort of histories of superdiversity and, as you put it, its entanglement with super inequalities.
Well, I can't think of the notion of superdiversity without thinking of it as a struggle. A struggle to define diversity, a struggle to acknowledge diversity against a tremendous weight of history, especially in the context of the United States, and for me, especially in the context of Los Angeles and California, to suppress diversity, to deny diversity, to eradicate diversity. You know, that's my primary understanding of Los Angeles history. So I gave this talk with the hope that you know, we're aware of what we're up against in this effort to explore superdiversity in Southern California.
And I might, in terms of kind of new research and ways to kind of approach these questions of superdiversity, I might kind of ground such studies in places that maybe defy what we thought we knew about kind of intercultural relations and multi-ethnic connections. I'm thinking of the recently retitled South Los Angeles, right? It used to be South Central. And I think what is conspicuous and maybe startling about that neighborhood is the ways in which it showcases Black suburbanization and the ways in which diversity of immigrants from throughout Latin America, not just Mexico, have made it their own. And so you find these minority Black population trying to kind of retain and hold on to a historically black neighborhood in the face of a majority kind of Latino population. So what does it mean for black flight to occur from a particular space? And maybe to push beyond Los Angeles that continues to kind of dominate our understandings of superdiversity, maybe rightfully so, given that it is this intersection of global migrations. But look at a place like Irvine, right, where you get, again, a very different kind of combination of peoples. There you have the question of kind of wealthier Asian immigrants with the capital that they have invested, shaped by the planning initiatives of Irvine founders. And what does diversity look like there as you have kind of a variety of wealthier kind of Asian immigrants, established white residents, and kind of poorer kind of Mexican and other Latino domestics and service workers who are coming into that neighborhood. So what, again, do these questions, how do we explore them in those kind of unusual but still kind of grounded neighborhoods? And for me, I'm because my work identified the possibilities of integration, I'd also look in those realms of kind of education, the ways in which students studying together or not studying together influences their kind of larger life chances, or how they kind of understand a sense of community. And again, as in those schools where you have young people who are influential, who are thinking about California's future, I think that might also be a fruitful space for investigations.
What about your new project, just to sort of say a word about that?
Sure, which maybe, again, kind of pulls away, not to the American South, but to Asia. But I'm trying to write a history about the adoption of Vietnamese children by Americans after really Americans discovered Vietnam through the Vietnam War. And this is a population that is dispersed throughout the United States, although there are, of course, heavy concentrations of Vietnamese refugees in California, particularly in Orange County, and the kind of assimilation and the representation of these Vietnamese adoptees was influenced by their interactions with these Vietnamese immigrants. And again, I guess in terms of thinking about the layers of diversity since 1965, it's really about kind of Asian immigrants from unexpected locations, right? From Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Laos, and also immigrants coming from Latin America, not from Mexico. And how does that sheer kind of variety, again, kind of complicate and kind of enrich notions of what is Asian American and what is kind of a Latin American identity are questions to consider too.
Okay, I'll open it up in 1 minute because I want to leave time for you all to join into the conversation, which is what I think this conference is all about. But I guess I would sort of, not by way of summary, but to think about, it's not, as I said, that there's a confusing set or contradictory set of messages that have come out. And I think those, that's part of, and Eric, you framed it, but you know well, that LA stories have often been told in the sort of sunshine versus noir kind of dichotomy, and that we sometimes can't seem to find ways to sort of find ways to link these up. And I think your talk certainly does in terms of the way the mythology creates certain powerful meanings, but that there's a historical reality that needs to be grappled with, and all the papers do. I said in my remarks how it seemed to me that the papers, or the presentations move between the hopeless and the hopeful, but it's also, I think, that they reject the kind of a simple linear kind of story, or a simple story of progress, ever greater integration, or ever more, sort of ever more greater embrace of superdiversity, that sort of we might congratulate ourselves somehow that we've come to some new awakening, and that we live in somehow, sort of these now sort of hopeful times. And maybe they are more hopeful, but I think one of the things that emerges, especially from the deeper historical perspective that my fellow panelists have offered, is sort of not a simple sort of straight line from past to ever more progressive or integrated or hopeful super diverse present, but one that sort of has all sorts of eddies and confusing and conflicting sort of stories. I don't know what we make of that or what we do with that, though.
Well, I think one of the things is that Los Angeles is not an island, and so it is affected by the world economy. It's affected by, structural forces within the United States. And so regardless of the super diversity that we have here, it is going to be within the context of these larger structures that affect every group. I think that we also have to continue to understand that impact.
No, definitely not a linear line of progress, of enlightenment. And think about the 1990s in California was a bad time to acknowledge super diversity. I mean, this was the decade that gave us Prop 187 and Prop 227 and
LA riots.
And yes, the LA riots and this whole slew of racial conflicts, of racial projects. To in a way kind of go back to that past that I write about in my first book. So you're right, it goes backwards and forwards at the same time.
It does seem though that there is the greater recognition of diversity has, I think, moved scholars and maybe a larger public beyond kind of that black-white binary that Brenda talked about. I think we are increasingly kind of looking in those multiple directions in the past as well as in our present, and that maybe gives a greater analytical rigor.
Okay, I think it's time, we have some time left, which is what we're planning is to open it up. Do we have a microphone to go to the audience, or how do we want people to, I can repeat the question if I can hear it. Do you want me to give mine?
Yeah, one of the mics up and down. Oh, this one too.
Oh, okay, let's see what we can do here.
Oh, that one's tethered?
This is tethered also. Okay, so I'm not sure how we're going to do. But stand up, and maybe if you
Shout.
project, we can pick it up. Stand up, please. Yes.
I would certainly like to thank the panel for giving us kind of broad historical strokes about our most recent past. I have this question, which probably deepens this question about inclusion and progress, which is about what you think the past may offer us in thinking about what differential racialization may look like going forward. And I say this, for example, Tomás Almaguer's study of 19th century California really looks at how people were differentially positioned on a racial hierarchy. Stratification proceeded along very different principles. And from his vantage point of growing up in Ventura County in the 50s and 60s, he's amazed to learn of how high in valuation, for example, Mexicans were in 19th century California as compared to some of the other groups. So the point is, I guess the simple question is, looking at this kind of past, looking at that, it's not a simple matter that all groups have confronted white supremacy or white racial dominance in the same manner. Yes, there's been residential segregation, labor market restrictions, so forth. But there's been really sharp differences too. And what might those differences tell us about what the shape of racial hierarchy and stratification may look like going forward?
The going forward part is always the problem that historians want to say, yeah, that's for tomorrow. But no, we're not, no. We are not going to abdicate that. I'm going to, no. Fellow panelists.
Well, I think that one of the things that we do learn is that each group that comes into Los Angeles or into our society more broadly speaking, depending on their relationship with the government, and that group is often racialized and often finds themselves in opposition. People, everyday people find opposition. And for example, now we tend to racialize those people who are Islamic in faith. And very similar ways to the ways in which we racialize people in the 19th century who were Jewish in faith, or who were Catholic in faith as well. So I think that we can understand that whenever we find new groups of people or even older groups of people who find themselves in conflict with what is the popular narrative of where the United States is vis-a-vis the world, and what we want to be as a nation, we find that these people are, we are opposed to them in a particular kind of way that oftentimes is racialized. And I think we can learn from that we don't fall into the same kinds of pits that we have done throughout our history, whether we're looking at Native peoples in the past, in the 15th or 16th century, or we're looking at African slaves, or whether we're looking at, people from Central America, or, Asia in the 19th century, the Jews at the end of the 19th century, et cetera, et cetera. We should understand by now that we've always had a kind of anxiety around difference, particularly difference if it seems to threaten the state agenda, and that anxiety has caused us to marginalize and oppress people. And if we're to learn anything from the past, I think that's one of the key issues in terms of moving forward. So I assume that because we have such a long trajectory of doing this, that when we do confront new peoples who seem to come from a nation or nations or region or culture that seems in opposition to ours or threatening to ours, that these people will be marginalized, whether they're in Los Angeles or whether they're, in small country towns that still exist.
This might be kind of an indirect answer, but I think the question is so difficult to answer in part because of, I think, accelerated intermarriage, which raises the question of what are the categories, let alone how do we rank those categories. And I think about my students at Cal State Fullerton who are so diverse, right, that they embody that super diversity, and that they identify themselves in so many multiple ways rather than to a particular kind of a heritage or the traditional ethno-racial groups, that there have been traditional ethno-racial groups. So I think because it's in some ways it's hard to imagine how the rankings will happen, because there is a profusion. There's either going to be kind of a profusion of new rankings, and we'll go the way of the Spanish and set up a case system with 150 different categories, or we'll imagine kind of a white and then a brown group. But I think that adds kind of complexity to the efforts to kind of predict what those racializations will be.
I think the problem is that racial identity is never held still for its portrait, and so they're always in motion. They're always changing. My talk notwithstanding, I'm actually optimistic about the fact that I don't believe that whiteness is going to sustain itself as a dominant paradigm of political and economic power. I just don't think the demographics of the region will support that. That's not to say that I believe that hierarchies will suddenly disappear. I think we'll find new ways to classify, categorize populations and identities along some kind of hierarchy. But I don't believe that the way, the tradition, the racial tradition that is ingrained in American history, I think it is going to break down, and I think this is one place where that's going to happen first.
Right, but it doesn't seem to me that as long as we're playing the optimism game for a moment, I don't get anything from your talk that the demise of whiteness is in any way will be tied to the decline of inequality.
It may or may not be. Again, I think in a place where whites are increasingly a minority, and you can't even use that term with the certainty that you could use it a generation ago or 2 generations ago. It doesn't mean the same thing. I'm not personally, I'm not optimistic about, optimistic's the wrong word, but I don't believe that way that race has been understood is going to carry forward into the future.
Can I be heard? Our discussion, I think, is heading in the direction of thinking about racialization as somehow a means to manage difference. And there are some other ways that one might begin to think about that might help us move forward in our discussion. And I would ask you the question, historically, what have indeed been the functions of racialization? And it seems to me most profoundly, it has been in the maintenance of inequality. So looking to the future, do we see, how do we see racialization functioning, group differences functioning? Because this management of relations between one small group and another, or one large group and another, it's sort of a micro picture and not really getting us to the larger view of how our society is structured, and how, in a sense, some tracks have been built that are very, very difficult to escape.
Pedestrian tracks and freeways have been built.
Yes,
That structure racial
Yes,
difference, and that's the difficult part. As I think about in my work on freeways, highway construction, as I argue, help to make race. They help to delineate spatial boundaries of different racialized communities, and they provoked a sharp racial retort to that work during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. That is extremely difficult to just walk away from that past that is ingrained in the built environment of Southern California.
I think historically, racialization has been useful to those persons who had the powerful positions of eliminating access to resources, natural resources, but also other kinds of resources. Today, we see it, for example, particularly in higher education. It continues to be used in that kind of way. It's also been used to manage intimacy, as you suggest about the marriages, which is breaking down. And I know the research that Belinda has done, and other people in the audience too, on intermarriage. Racialization has been used to manage spaces, as Eric has pointed out in his wonderful writings and in his talk today. And it's also, I think, been used to manage anxiety about one's place in society when that society has not given access, or when people don't find themselves equal. Racialization has been used to manage anxiety about inequality. And with this, I mean particularly about the creation of whiteness and what it means to be white. These are the other people, even if you are poor, even if you are disfranchised, et cetera, et cetera. Whiteness has some value, it has some importance, and therefore you have that. So I think in those ways, racialization has been used to manage all kinds of things in this country and, in much of the world as well. So I'm not sure how those kinds of concerns will be managed in the past. What will be the new ways of controlling or limiting access? But certainly the tension around limiting access of those things that we believe will help people to have good and decent and lives, housing, healthcare, education, etc. Those tensions really still do exist in our society. And look at Congress today, So I'm not sure how what that's going to take on in the future.
Well, and this comes back to you, Allison, and now it's become a topic, and I know it's a topic tomorrow. And it's certainly at the heart of what the Institute of American Culture seeks to do in terms of exploring the entangled histories here and entangled futures between groups. And in your talk, Allison, you certainly highlighted the ways in which these intermarriages between non-white peoples in these multi-ethnic neighborhoods were sort of relatively rare still, and they were resisted by parents often who sort of saw this kind of crossing as being a dangerous thing to do. And we certainly had arguments in the dissertation process, which I guess we can own up to here, about how typical these were and whether you could really sort of make the sort of claims you were making. But what happens in a world, and this actually came up in your remarks, where suddenly it's not a rare occurrence, but it is the norm, where all of the lines that Brenda was confused when she came to Los Angeles in 1992 or 91.
One.
What?
One.
think how much more confused it will be to come in 2021 or 31 or 41 when the categories that we've grown accustomed to sort of have completely sort of become even more difficult when you go on your hike 20 or 30 years from now.
Yeah, that's optimistic.
And whether that means, I guess, resorting to new kinds of categories, and it's hard to imagine what the substance of those categories were, but given the necessity of defining or creating these differences, whether it means a greater reliance upon religion, a greater reliance upon how recently you arrived in the United States, whether those will weigh more heavily than some of the other criteria of difference.
Class.
So I have the sign being held in front of me saying "last question." So I have and I think we get to make, since she's our organizer, you get to ask the last question. Linda.
Well, I guess this has been remarkably revealing. You know, a lot of material I certainly didn't know as a social psychologist. But I guess I had a question for all of you as historians who have a much, much broader take on these things. And that is, I guess, the arc that shows how threat is related to repression. I mean, Professor Avila mentioned in the 1990s when, of course, California was becoming, and I hate to use the absurd phrase, but still, majority-minority, is when you saw all those laws being passed. You know, see it in Arizona. The fact that this president has more threats on his life than any previously, again, another kind of threat. On the other hand, it looks like we're going to have an immigration bill, finally, because it became clear to some people in the election that, hey, this thing is real. These people are going to be powerful determinants of the future. I mean, so in the long term, you know, how do you see these things playing out? You know, there must be a threshold. You know, at some point, you know, instead of threat and repression, something else happens. And, you know, that seems to be happening to some extent in immigration, but do you see, from your historical perspective, you know, how these things are playing out?
It seems that this is not an optimistic reading, but it seems that is the pattern in history of kind of threat and response, of ascendant kind of nativism, at least in kind of the immigration question, whether there's another model or a break from the cycle. I don't necessarily see that based upon the historical example.
I'm not naive enough to believe that nativism will ever go away. I just don't believe that nativism will be as attached to whiteness as it has been in the American past. I think language could be a basis for a new kind of nativism in the future, or perhaps religion, or certain class. Class is always an anchor for social conflict expressed through race, through gender, through religion, language, other forms of identity. All three of these questions have been asking us to predict the future. We're the last people in the world to predict the future. But I don't think that the old tropes of white supremacy are going to structure social conflict in the future the way that it has in the past. It's too different now, I believe.
I would have to agree that threat and repression has been the kind of pattern of U.S. history, but not just the U.S. and in the world in general. You'll see this happening. When power is at stake, people want to maintain it and all that comes with it, and so they repress people that they feel threatened. One of the things that I was really devastating when I was doing this book was to trace the sort of trajectories of the families of the three women that I spoke about, and this gets to the issue of class, because class is important, and I think it will continue to be, and certain people find themselves in certain classes, and there is still a hierarchy. But what I found, for example, for the Hollins family, and I was able to go back and to find their actually slave ancestors, was that from Mississippi and Alabama, where they were enslaved, and then sharecroppers, and then from sharecroppers they moved up to East St. Louis. You know, East St. Louis is one of the most impoverished cities. It's also a city of particularly black women. I mean, there's more black women who live in East St. Louis than any other category of people. And then from East St. Louis to South Central Los Angeles during the era of crack, you know, cocaine, which infiltrated their families. And so, you know, it just seemed for that family, and then Latasha's brother, you know, has been in prison, and, you know, so it just seemed to continue. And it's a class-based, because race is also important, of course, in culture as well, but it's a class-based issue. So I think that class will continue. I'm not sure when race will pass away. I don't know. I know there's loss of intermarriage. We still tend to, there's not been enough yet for people not to see races, I think, you know, but there will always be, I think, a hierarchy, and there will be dividers that are around, I think, in some ways associated with power and repression and the threat that's associated with both of them.
So our time, Keeper told me time is up. I want to first go thank all of you for joining us this evening. And staying, most of you. And also thank my fellow panelists. I mentioned at the outset that I was proud that history got to kick off these proceedings. And I should add that in the history department we have introduced a series of public programs around the theme of why history matters. Along these kind of debates, looking at present problems and bringing the lens of history and the insights of historians into dialogue with community activists and political leaders and our brethren in the social sciences. I want to thank my fellow panelists because I think at the very least, whatever the confusions and conflicts among their testimonies, I hope what they've shown you is just how much history matters.
Oh, thank you so much, Alice. And I want, in particular, to thank Professor Aaron, who actually put this panel together. We knew that history had to come first, but that he would put back just the perfect constellation of people to begin this conference is a tribute to your work. Thank you. And that title was right, I am sure now, the history of the world forever and ever, whatever it was, right? Just one announcement. We begin tomorrow at 9 o'clock and go all day. There will be lunch for people wondering if you have to starve in this room all day. Registration starts at 8, and I thank all of you for coming and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.